UP system, and also UP Diliman. So for today, the lecture will focus on Dr. Max Lane's recent book entitled Indonesia Out of Exile. Okay. And then tomorrow, we'll have the second leg, the second lecture, also here at the conference area of UPCIDS. But the topic will be different. We'll talk about the question of democratization, the national revolution in Indonesia, and of course, its relevance to the Philippine context. And then the last lecture will be at my home college at the School of Labor and Industrial Relations. We'll have it on Saturday afternoon also. And that will be a talk about the labor movement in Indonesia. Although I'm sure the discussion will move towards like a comparative discussion with the Philippine context, maybe even broader here in Southeast Asia. So anyway, uh, I'm honored to welcome you here, those of us here physically or residentially, and then others that are joining us online. So maraming salamat, thank you, and welcome Max, who's also a good friend. Maraming salamat.
So much, Benji, for welcoming us to this event. And we do hope that everyone can get to attend the other lectures tomorrow, still here at UPCIDS Conference Hall. And also on Saturday, we have the session at UP Soler. And now to give us the opening remarks of our public lecture for today, may we call on the chairperson of the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature, Professor Shedar B. Hoxon. Let's give him a round of applause.
Magandang araw. Good afternoon. Salamat siyang. It has been said time and time again that literature is a reflection of one society and of social movements. However, literature is not only a reflection, but also serves as a catalyst of social movements, of social development. In the early years of the American colonial rule in the Philippines, one of the first quote unquote social movements that talks about our independence and the cry for justice are quote unquote seditious plays. These plays, as I said, labeled seditious by the American colonizers, would soon pave the way for various social movements and eventually be the impetus for numerous social movements, both among the people and of the academe, particularly in the literary world. We now read and see our literature with a framework that develops a critical and analytical eye for the intricate relations of literature and society. In the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature, our Larangan ng Panitikan or the Literature Division has been at the forefront of teaching and developing subjects that talks about literature and society. Subjects like literary history, literary relations of the Philippines and of Southeast Asia, and even theory and literary criticism has been continuously developed and harnessed to discuss and deepen the relationship of literature and society. Today, we are honored to be a part of this afternoon's endeavor with the renowned Indonesian studies scholar Dr. Max Lane. His deep knowledge and very analytical perspective of one of his deep knowledge and very analytical perspective of one of the Philippines' closest neighbor geographically and culturally will be of big help with our literary classes in the department. With him is our esteemed Dr. Ramon Guillermo, the director of the Center for International Studies, and one of our young and very productive Professor Amado Anthony Mendoza. The department is thankful for the program on alternative development of the Center for Integrative and Development Studies and and of the College of Arts and Letters. For the first of the many, I hope, many world experts lecture series, we know that this will be not the last partnership involved. We are going to be involved. So I will not let you wait further. Uh, maraming salamat. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Professor Hoxon, for introducing not only the program for the day, but also discussing how we teach Southeast Asian literature in our department, the Department of Filipino, wherein we also discuss these topics in relation to Philippine progressive and revolutionary literature.
That's right. And now to speak about Pramoedya, Indonesian literature and nation, we have the honor to hear from Dr. Max Lane, visiting senior fellow from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore. He is the translator of 6 books by Pramoedya Ananta, including This Earth of Mankind and its 3 sequels, now known as the Buro Quartet, published by Penguin USA. His other books include Unfinished Nation, Indonesia Before and After Suharto, and Verso 2008, Catastrophe in Indonesia, Seagull 2010, and an introduction to politics of Indonesian unions by Isaias 2018. He has also translated plays and poems by W.S. Rendra, including The Struggle of the Naga Tribe, originally published in 1978, but recently republished in the Methuen Drama Anthology of Modern Asian Plays, Methuen 2040.
And Max Lane has also worked as a journalist, researcher in the Australian Parliament, a human rights activist, lecturer, and teacher. He's also an irregular guest lecturer at the Gajah Mada University and other Indonesian universities. One of his latest books, which his discussion will also draw from, and will be available for sale starting tomorrow here at UP-SIDS. If you want to get a copy, it's Indonesia Out of Exile, How Pramoedya's Buro Quartet Killed the Dictatorship. So we hope you get to go back here tomorrow, attend the second lecture, and get yourself a copy of this book. Let us all welcome our main speaker, Max Lane.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody in Zoom land. I can't hear them answering back, but I'll assume they're saying good afternoon back to us all. So I thank very much UP and also, and of course, SIDS and all the friends from the Alternative Development Program here to organizing this event for me today. And as was announced by the moderator, the starting point for what I want to talk about today is my new book. Why did I write this book, Indonesia Out of Exile, about the books of Pramoedya Ananta Toer, published right back in the 1980s in both Indonesian and in English. So both the Indonesian version and the English translation have now been in print for almost 40 years without break. Now, why did I write this book in the first place 40 years after the event? First of all, it was because of a promise I made to Pramoedya and to his publisher and editor, Yusuf Ishak, and Hashim Rahman, all of whom had been political prisoners under the Suharto dictatorship. I promised them that the full details of their struggle to publish their books, or Pramoedya's books, would be told not only to the outside world, but to also Indonesians. And I was very lucky because I was living in Jakarta in 1980-81 and saw Pramoedya and Yusuf Ishak and Hashim Rahman, the 3 men who made the publication possible despite the dictatorship. I was able to talk to them a lot and made that promise, and was also able to see things firsthand as to how they develop. But if we can go back to the first slide, I should also, when I was thinking about the talk today, I was thinking about the story of Pramoedya's books. And I remembered, and this is an incident not put in the book, that one of my first ever contacts with the Philippines was in the early 1980s, when a meeting was held in Bangkok, organized by the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, UNITAR, which was at that time headed by a United Nations staff person who came from Vietnam and who had a sympathetic perspective on progressive movements in Southeast Asia. And UNITAR organized a seminar in Bangkok to discuss the question of how original and alternative histories of the Southeast Asian societies could be supported and encouraged. And from the Philippines, there was, I forget everybody who was in the Philippines delegation, but certainly Renato Constantino Sr. was in the delegation from the Philippines who came to Bangkok. And one of the organizers of this, Jomo Sundaram from Malaysia, who somebody told me may be watching from Malaysia via Zoom, explained that they needed an Indonesian representation at this meeting in Bangkok. And the obvious choice was those Indonesians connected to the publication project of Pramoedya's novels, which were an alternative history of the origins of Indonesia. But neither Pramoedya nor his editors were allowed to leave the country. So I was designated to represent them and go to Bangkok, where I met Renato Constantino Sr., and there was discussions about how alternative histories of Southeast Asia could be supported and further developed. So I suppose there's a thread of continuity that goes right back to 1982 in terms of collaboration and cooperation between the Philippines and Indonesia on the question of rediscovering and re-explaining a vision of history that's different and counters the dominant visions of history that are presented throughout Southeast Asia. And of course, the same goes for my own country, Australia. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is partly of my book, Indonesia Out of Exile, is basically the story of the publishing house, the publishing endeavor called Hasta Mitra. You can see up there on the top left-hand corner, picture of Pramoedya, Yusuf Ishak, who is the editor and political spokesperson for the publisher, and down the bottom, Hashim Rahman, long-term journalist, who was in the same prison camp as Pramoedya during the 70s, during the 60s and 70s, and who was the businessman and manager behind the whole project. And you can see the original cover of Bumi Manusia, This Earth of Mankind, published in 1981. And the thing to note about it is what it says on the top: Roman Karya Pulau Buru. So they announced from the very beginning on the cover and in the newspaper advertising that this was a novel written in the prison camp of Pulau Buru. And that was one of the most defiant things the publishers did with this publication. Next slide. So this is my new book. As the moderator said, it'll be on sale tomorrow and on Saturday. You can also buy it in the Philippines now via Shopee. Next slide. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk about the publication of the book as a specific form of political praxis Next slide. Because the book was an intervention into the political processes taking place at that time. It was published in 1981, so you have to think of what the situation in Indonesia was between 1978 and 1981 and into the 80s. That's a contradictory. It's a contradictory situation. Because on the one hand, 15,000 political prisoners were released from prison after being in jail since 1966. Most of the men were on a prison camp on Pulau Buru, and the women were in the prison camp on the island of Java. So on the one hand, they're released, but the contradiction is they were released at a time when political repression was at its greatest. Of course, the ultimate greatest was back in 65, 66, when 1 million people were killed, and everybody who wasn't killed was either jailed or banned from activity. But the next wave of repression reached its peak in 1978. So they were released just when the Suharto dictatorship was at the height of repression. For example, in 1978, all student councils were banned on all campuses. All student councils were banned. All political activity by students on campuses were banned. Many student leaders were put in prison, put on trial, and then in prison. So Pramoedya, Yusuf Ishak, Hashim Rahman, and 15,000 others were released from jail, mainly as a result of the pressure of the Carter administration and just the impossibility of keeping 20,000 people in jail forever. They were released into a society where repression was at its height. And of course, the amazing thing was, if you think about it, they were released in 1979, late 1979. By 1981, they had published the first of the books. This was an extremely courageous and act of defiance. With Pulau Buru, this is a novel from Pulau Buru, on the front cover, and even in the advertising in the mainstream newspapers. You know, at that time, I tell some of this in the book. I won't go into much detail here, but at that time, if you were a journalist or writer and you received a phone call from the police or intelligence saying, withdraw that article, everybody said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. But here come people accused of being evil communists coming out of a prison camp. They get the phone call, withdraw this book immediately. Their reply, we'll consider it if you send us the formal letter. And they just defied as long as they could. In contrast to the whole of the rest of the intelligence at the time, they defied the authorities in this way. Next slide. Now, the interesting thing was when the book came out, it took the regime several months before they banned it. And I think this was due to a number of reasons. First, they were caught off guard. No one even thought that people associated with the Communist Party in the Indonesian left, even before 1 year was over from getting out of prison. No one in the government even imagined that they would immediately publish a book in such a defiant way by one of the left's most preeminent writers. So they were caught off guard. But they used that opportunity of the regime being caught off guard to engage in a strategy that bought them several months' time. First, they took advantage of the fact that the vice president of Indonesia had been in his left-wing anti-Dutch activist. That was Vice President Adam Malik. So Pramoedya, you can see in this photo here, Pramoedya, Yusuf Ishak, Hashim Rahman, meet Adam Malik in the vice presidential palace, have several photo opportunities which get onto the front page of the newspapers. And Adam Malik makes the statement, the vice president of Indonesia makes the statement that every school student in Indonesia should read Bumi Manusia. So once the vice president makes that statement, of course, it becomes difficult for Suharto, the president, to immediately ban it. So there took place, and you can read in my book the more detailed telling of what happened over those several months. That there basically took place a Psy war, a battle between the government and these three men. One of whom, I won't say which one of them ended up in jail again for a few months. Read the book to find out. In this process of defending the publication of the book, which was eventually banned after several months. But they published the sequel, which was then banned, the next sequel, which was then banned, the next sequel, which was then banned. And actually, Hasta Mitra, the publishing company of these three men who published this, ended up publishing 70 titles over 15 years, including the first Indonesian translation of the 3 volumes of Das Kapital, but many other books as well. Next slide. The book itself, I think, smashed many myths in many different ways. No one can read the book, and everyone who did read the book from across the spectrum of politics in Indonesia could not be moved by its deep humanist spirit and its democratic sensibilities. The fact that Pramoedya could write a book immediately went against all of the black propaganda against him and other people who'd been detained in 1965. Because the anti-communist propaganda in Indonesia did not focus at all whatsoever in any way on critiquing communist or socialist thinking, but concentrated on black propaganda that communists were evil, killers, rapists, liars, etc., etc. And of course, as soon as you read Bumi Manusia, you think this cannot be possibly written by a rapist, communist, evil liar. So that already, especially as the young people read it, damaged, eroded a key element of black propaganda during this Suharto period. And it established a new reputation for Pramoedya and his whole generation amongst young students, so students who are just beginning to study in the early 1980s. And it broke the mentorship of the previous student generation. So Indonesian history in this respect is a bit unique or a bit specific. In 1965, when the Suharto wing of the military took power and crushed the left, this crushing of the left was supported by a couple of student organizations that were, objectively speaking, on the right. They didn't have a specific ideological outlook, but when the military takeover took place, they joined the demonstrations calling for the smashing of the Communist Party and generally supported the Suharto government. But the two student organizations represented two generations. One student organization was an organization of conservative, anti-political university students. They were quickly absorbed into the political machinery of the new dictatorship. The other organization was an organization of high school students who supported the call, crush the Communist Party, etc., etc. But in the early years of the Suharto regime, when those high school students began to become university students, most of them developed as critics of the authoritarian tendencies of the Suharto government. Their they were mentored, politically mentored by intellectuals and academics who were associated with the Social Democratic Anti-Communist Socialist Party of Indonesia. So they were increasingly critical of the authoritarian measures of Suharto. They were very, very critical of the corruption. They were very, very critical of the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. But they were silent on the killings that occurred in 1965, and they were silent about the 20,000 people in prison. It was a very contradictory situation. Their mentors taught them anti-communism, but their own youthful instincts in response to the reactionary or the dictatorial situation emerging, also with evidence of new evidence or emerging evidence of corruption, they became critical but anti-communist. So it was like a blind spot for them. When Pramoedya's books came out, it was the next generation of students who, after reading Pramoedya and meeting other people who had been released from prison, no longer looked to the social democratic anti-communist intellectuals as their mentors. They had no effective direct mentors, but they started rereading. Well, they of course read everything that Pramoedya published. They started rereading about the history of Indonesia, the histories of Indonesia that have been so far blanked out. And one of the things they picked up from this was that students by themselves cannot change society. Students have to have an alliance with either workers, peasants, working masses. And that was something they learned from Pramoedya's own books, but also going back to reading about Indonesian history. And that encouraged throughout the 1980s the mushrooming, the flowering everywhere of hundreds and hundreds of discussion groups that by the late 1980s gave birth to a new student movement that was actively seeking alliances in the first phase with peasant farmers in the rural sector. Next slide. So before I go on to the books themselves, just to emphasize, that's why I called the subtitle of my book is The Book That Killed the Dictatorship. Because the breaking of that conservative mentorship, the introduction to the young students that an alliance was needed with workers and peasants, set in motion a process that in the end could not be stopped, resulted in the formation of new political groups and movements which brought Suharto down from power. And if you asked all the leaders and core activists of that movement, and even those who just participated but weren't in the leadership, if you ask them, who did you read? They'll say Pramoedya. Where did you learn about organizing? The 4th volume, Rumah Kaca, which is about how the first Jejak Langkah, the 3rd and 4th novels, about how mass organizations developed in the Dutch East Indies in the early 20s. But to get a real feel for the political impact of these books, it's also important to look at their content. Next slide. I think the first thing to note is that, Pramoedya as a historian, his primary focus, and I think his, the location of his genius, is in how he analyzes and depicts the origins of the Indonesian nation. His books basically, end in before 1920, this series of 4 novels. So he doesn't talk about the rise of the nationalist movement. He doesn't talk about the anti-colonial movement. His books, these 4 books, concentrate on the period where something which did not exist on planet Earth before and which nobody had even thought of, namely a nation that would become eventually called Indonesia. His books about how that all started. And of course, it was re-winning an authentic sovereignty over that history. Because prior to that, how everybody understood the emergence of the Indonesian nation was determined by what Dutch historians had wrote and what had been absorbed from that, or from what very nationalistic Indonesians wrote, who analyzed Indonesia as a continuity of the either great Javanese or Sumatran empires that had existed previously. Pramoedya's analysis, underlines the fact that it was neither the Dutch that created Indonesia, or even framed its creation, and neither is Indonesia a continuity from the past. It's a rupture. It's new, totally and completely new. And I think that's a part of the power of the novels within Indonesia, apart from the fact that it also broke the strength of the black propaganda narrative that all people on the left were these evil communists. Next slide. I have a chapter in my book called, I forget what it's exactly called. My memory it's not very precise, but it's basically called the absence of Indonesia. And it relates to the reality, of course, the empirical reality that at the turn of the 20th century, when Pramoedya's books are set, the word Indonesia did not exist. The reason why the word Indonesia did not exist was that even the idea of Indonesia did not exist. And why did the idea of Indonesia not exist? Because material concrete developments in the archipelago were only then beginning to construct the process that would end up in the creation of this absolutely new phenomenon, Indonesia, and this absolutely new kind of human being, Indonesians. And Pramoedya's approach, in the way he outlines how a new human being comes onto the scene, represented by the main character Minka, is by linking the development of that personality in its very early stage to how social reality itself was changing. So Minka is a product of processes that emerge out of social reality itself. And I don't quote from Marx's German ideology at the bottom, which I think, I don't think Pramoedya read that, but I think he had the same approach. It was not about, it's very interesting, read all of Pramoedya's books. He doesn't give a hoot about identity. Am I Indonesian or not? None of the characters give a hoot about identity, but about what kind of social reality is actually evolving and in what direction it can be pushed. Next slide. So I think the 4 books, This Earth of Mankind, Child of All Nations, Footsteps, and House of Glass, can be divided into 2 sections. This Earth of Mankind and Child of All Nations are basically an analysis, a depiction, a presentation of the interacting social processes, social and economic processes that were happening at the turn of the 20th century. Footsteps and House of Glass are about how agency, organized forces, agency in the sense of organized forces trying to change things actually emerge. So if you read this Earth of Mankind or and Child of All Nations and compare it to Footsteps and House of Glass. In Footsteps and House of Glass, the main character it's shown how the main character, inspired by a real historical figure, tries to form the first anti-colonial organization called Sarekat Priai, the Priai's Union, or the Officials Union. That failed. And then he gets involved in forming the Sarekat Dagang Islamiyah, Islamic Traders Association, although he explains that the main character did not simply become involved in setting up Sarekat Dagang Islamiyah because he was into he was a merchant, although he was, but because he envisaged society as divided into those who were dependent on the colonial state for their livelihood, the Priai, and those who depended on their own efforts to survive and who were not dependent on the colonial state for their livelihood. That was the Dagang. So for him, Dagang or merchants was visualized as everybody who was not dependent on the colonial state for their income. So it included farmers, workers, yes, in merchants also, but everyone, which is why that organization was eventually able to get a membership of 2 million people, becoming the largest mass organization in the early 20th century in the world. So you get this division between process and it's also the difference between the process, the depiction of the process, how the new personality, Indonesian personality, starts to be formed. Even by the end of the book, the main character does not yet see himself as an Indonesian because the idea has still not yet evolved. So he's the prototype, if you like, of the new Indonesia. But what this process emphasizes, that it was all based on the concrete, real experience of people in that society then. Now, there is this theory, which I think is completely wrong, that the origins of nations is connected, that the nation is an imagined community. Well, I don't even know what the term means. Imagined community, it's not referring to an imaginary community. It's talking, what does imagined community mean? It means that somebody has an image or a picture of this new community, the nation, in their head. True. I'm sure Filipinos have a picture in their head of what the Philippines is sort of. And the same in the early 20th century. But where does the picture come from? The picture comes from the direct experience of a concrete, real reality as a nation, as a new type of nation, a new type of community starts to emerge. The nation is a experienced community, not imagined. Anything in the head comes after the experience as an interpretation of the experience. And I think that's what this Earth of Mankind and Child, that the personalities experience and respond to and react to. That's what develops, pushes along the development of a new consciousness. Next slide. And of course, then Jejak Langkah and concrete agency of change, which in the first instance represented by the character Minka, who's inspired by the real life person Tito Adisuryo, who published a newspaper, had a stationery company, established a hotel, run up and so on. He was a bourgeoisie, and even if you look at this Earth of Mankind, the main mentor of the imaginary Minka, as Tito Adisuryo imagined as a teenager, was also a capitalist, but one with a unique history. Someone who was sold as a young woman, managed successfully quite a big business after her Dutch owner. And the values she taught to Minka came from her experience as a person who had established through her own efforts and despite of her difficult background, a successful business. Minka himself, even as a teenager, if you read this Mankind, was already engaged in trying to sell furniture. It was this concept that don't be dependent on just receiving money from the colonial state. Earn money, earn your livelihood by your own effort. And so I think what Pramoedya's analysis is what at the turn of the century, this very early stage, the vanguard of change was coming from the indigenous or the local bourgeoisie, such as it was, tiny, of course. And by the end of the four novels, go on to the next slide. By the end of the novels, you can see that Minka fails, Nyainta Soro fails, his mentor person fails, and the scene is set for new agents of change to emerge, which has to break with both the remnants of caste ideology that the administrative class contained, and which in the end has to go beyond the weaknesses of the small bourgeoisie that the Dutch had allowed to develop. Next slide. So you get in pointers in Footsteps in the House of Glass, the emergence of figures which anybody who knows Indonesian history are figures connected to the first manifestation of the Indonesian Communist Party. Figures like Haji Miswak came back from Mecca and openly propagated Marxism. Marco and Simone, both figures who you can connect to the very early leadership of the Communist Party. So there's a shift there from people like Minka, the indigenous, the local bourgeoisie of the early 20th century, being replaced in the end by new figures or new agency more connected to the proletariat masses and the peasantry. And it's very interesting to think this absence of Indonesia. Try and imagine how Pramoedya wrote it. He wrote 4 volumes full of characters, both fictional and some based on real people, none of whom ever imagined Tito Arisuyo, the inspiration for the main character, and all the others. None of them even ever imagined. It was beyond their, they didn't even conceive that one day there would be a country called Indonesia. So Pramoedya knew that there would be an Indonesia. He fought for it and was an active citizen in the Republic of Indonesia. The readers in the 1980s knew that after this period being described, and Indonesia would emerge. But he had to write a book. I mean, there was not even the faintest tinge of awareness amongst any of the characters that Indonesia would eventually be created. That's why he took the conscious decision to write in the first person through the characters that existed then. There was the option that he could write novels that were narrated by somebody, looking back, who did know that eventually an Indonesian or the idea of Indonesia would develop. He chose to write it where both the voice of the narrator and all of the characters presented as not in the slightest having any idea that in 20 years' time people will be talking about Indonesia, and in 40 years' time there would be an Indonesian nation and even an Indonesian state. So these books are about the embryonic, the start, the origin. It's a creation story, and it's rewinning for Indonesians themselves their own analysis of that creation story. Next slide. I think the other thing I'd like to, that's Medan Pria is the newspaper that the character Minka or the character that inspired Minka eventually published. And just to emphasize that newspapers then, the vast majority of the Indonesian population was illiterate. So newspapers in and of themselves had very little impact. But mass meetings of the Syarikat Islam, and then later on Communist Party and Nationalist Party in the 20s and 30s. In the mass meetings, there would be the policy of reading out aloud the stories from the newspaper. So newspapers only became effective in this process when connected up with mass movement organization. Next slide. So in 1980, I already talked a bit about how they broke the mentorship of the previous student generation, broke the conservative mentorship of students. But there was also, because there was this new creation story that connected people with both the values of past struggles, history, plus the ideas of the Enlightenment. These books become both a tool of struggle and a tool of self-analysis. They really play a pioneering role in the 1980s and into the 1990s, even though there were arrests. So there were people arrested and imprisoned for 4, 5, 6 years for doing nothing else but selling the books. Students who opened a stall on campus selling the books, arrested, tried, imprisoned for 4 or 5 years. Despite that, the radicalization process that was facilitated and encouraged by these books continued. Next slide. I think it's important, though, when we talk about this, to mention one important feature of Pramoedya's writings, and actually of his whole generation on the left. But Pramoedya, as perhaps their greatest intellectual, it has to be noted. While he is absolutely the outstanding genius of discovering and explaining the creation story of Indonesia and explaining it in a way which inspired people, there's no actual critique. He's never wrote a critique, and I think nobody has written yet. And it's probably unlikely to ever happen now because most of that generation are passed away already. But what about there's no critique of his own generation's political struggle. His own generation, on the left at least, struggled for a socialist Indonesia. But what we have now is a completely, deeply capitalist. So they completely failed. Not only is it a deeply capitalist Indonesia, but up until now, there's not a socialist movement in Indonesia either. So where is the explanation of how did that happen? How did a movement where more than half of the adult population were actively involved in socialist-oriented organizations, how did it vanish? Of course, the terror is one example, but that's not a sufficient explanation by itself. Why was there no preparation for the terror? Why was there no expectation of it? Why was there no ability to recover after, etc.? All need an historical explanation. I think the other aspect of this, if there's a, Pramoedya was once interviewed and he's asked about Indonesia, and he said, "I am a stranger here," because Indonesia had changed so much after 1965 that I think he didn't really recognize it. That's why the title of my book is Indonesia Out of Exile, because I think when the prisoners returned and his books were published, the Indonesia that existed before 65 came back out of exile and was able to communicate again with the youth. But it had to communicate in the youth in a very difficult situation of 32 years of continuous totalitarian dictatorship. So the challenge now is for regeneration. Next slide. I think the writer's work for the nation as a whole is ending. Since the fall of dictatorship, especially maybe in the last 20 years, the effervescence, I call it the fermentation. It's a bit like what you read, what the impression you might get if you read This Earth of Mankind. There's no agency. There's no in the change that's taking place. You can't identify any major force changing things right at the beginning of the 20th century. That's how a chemical process almost, with so many different variables interacting with each other, that ferment, out of which eventually comes organized agency. Next slide. So, in this fermentation, history is clearly a key thing. The question, what is our history, is strong motivation amongst much of radicalizing youth in Indonesia today as this fermentation takes place. There's new magazines about history, new publications about history, a boom in the publication of memoirs, especially of people who have been involved in political struggle, plays about history, films about history, which is a relatively new phenomenon in the last 10 years. No clear answers yet, no new book, no new analysis about what happened between 1920 and 1965 and 1965 and today. No new analysis has yet emerged which inspires and motivates, but the ferment is there, with bubbling everywhere with new books and ideas. Next slide. So Pramoedya's books are still in print. They no longer have novel from Buru in front of them, unfortunately, but they're still in print. You can find them in any bookshop, anywhere in Indonesia. Often in the major bookshops, there's a separate table specifically for Pramoedya's books. Next slides. Many of his other books in the earlier period are also now published, including Sang Pemula, which is his non-fiction book about the character that inspired Minka. Next slide. Books about Pramoedya are also everywhere now. The one on the left is a book comprising quotations from his speeches and writings and his novels, etc. Next slide. Quotations. You can go on the web and you'll find websites which have nothing else in them but quotations from Pramoedya. And you find the same quotations painted on the back of a truck, careering around Indonesia, delivering goods, whatever, timber or whatever. They'll have a quotation from Pramoedya's novel on the back of the truck. And as I said, you Google, you find quotations everywhere. So it's endemic. It's not just something confined to the literati, people who are interested in books. The influence has become endemic, especially amongst young people with a critical mindset. Next slide. More small quotes. You find them everywhere. And if you see the next slide, and T-shirts. So you go to a bookshop or somewhere else, you'll find people selling T-shirts with a picture of Pramoedya, a quotation, or even a picture of Minka or himself. Again, it's a part of the student critical or youth critical popular culture. Next slide. So this is kind of this earth of this earth of mankind process with no big strong agency happening, but all sorts of factors and variables coming together. Now I say there's no agency, but I think you can see embryos of agency in this unfamiliar ferment, and I can tell you all of these embryos of agency have connections with people who've read from these books. Especially next slide. So this is sort of, I'm just going to end with this. You can really, if you live there, you can feel the ferment all the time. And I think there's different parallel origins, points of starting point. One is this new special kind of unions. Quite unusual, I think. New character too. I mean, these are new unions, so they're not the big ones with the big numbers yet, but a new, different kind of character with a new kind of special cultural and political orientation. I'll be talking about them on Saturday. So you can see the union there is represented in the middle slide on the right. On the top, no, the top one is the union picture with some of the workers assembled. The other one is Arajuan. That's one example. It's not the only example, but it's one example of the new progressive newspapers that are emerging. Arajuan has been going now for 5 years. Unstoppable. Of course, everybody uses pen names. There's no physical location for the paper, but it gets out and it spreads to more and more. The bottom slide is women's liberation struggle. I think the feminist, the progressive feminist radicalization is the one that's taking place fastest at the moment. And many of them who read Pramoedya will make reference to the strong female characters. And the other one is the humanist art. The bottom one is a play that's about the trials and tribulations of women who were imprisoned in 1965 because they were connected to the Communist Party in one way. So when you're there, you can feel all these new initiatives, this new starting point. But again, it's a bit like this other mankind and of all nations. There's no big, major, concrete forces, agency of change yet in existence. Next slide. And the other thing is books. I thought, well, let's advertisements for books in Indonesia now. I said, well, what will I select? There's just too many. You can see here, Lenin, what is socialism? Marxism, feminist books. I think now in Indonesia, go to the next slide. I go back to the earlier one. That's a better picture. You will find every single left-wing progressive book ever written from the classics of the 19th century up until the most recent academic works coming out of the academic left around the world. You will find them in Indonesian language. Of course, the spreading of Marxism is still illegal. So there's a certain risk in publishing these books, but you can find them everywhere, especially online. Click online, transfer the money to the ATM, and the book will be at your address in a few days. It's been like that for a few years now, but I think at the moment it's reaching it. There's just so much of it. Next slide. But so to me, if you want to compare it to the Pramoedya novels, this period is of unfinished ferment. It's a bit like the social processes reflected in his first novel. The third novel, Footsteps, that's about how organized mass forces emerge. Uh, that's still to come. But I think with if you look at the newspapers, the new union, art form, that is going to come. Next year, 5 years, 10 years, that's something perhaps you can't tell. Of course, Glasshouse, the fourth book, was how the Dutch intelligence services organized the assassination of the Tito Adisudja and how that first wave of the movement was crushed. I think people going back to history are very aware of the dangers of that, and will figure out ways to handle it. I think the other thing that we'll have to see in Footsteps, you see the first mass organizations emerging, but you don't see the first important Indonesian political thinkers emerging. That starts in the 1920s. And I think that's also something that we'll see in the next coming period. All those books, tons of them, hundreds of them, being read by young people, but not yet any major writing by Indonesians on their own situation now and what to do. I think that's the next thing that we'll see. And I think, well, I expect to see that very quick, because that kind of writing, although not consolidated, is starting to happen in the newspapers that are being published. So I'll finish there. On the note of unfinished ferment, I hope you'll get the opportunity to read Indonesia Out of Exile. I hope that book will give you an entry point to understanding the processes that have happened in Indonesia in the past and which are unfolding now. Thank you very much.
Max, for that very illuminating discussion. I'm sure everyone here has a lot of questions or comments that we could all share later on during the open forum. I personally was very, very fascinated with how you discuss the issues of reading and publishing and the role of literature in revolutionary movements, not only in the context of the novels themselves, right, by Pramoedya, but also its impact until now in Indonesia, which, as Max says, is still engaging with this politics of unfinished ferment. And so later on, we'll have more time to discuss all of these issues. But for now, let us present to you the next speaker who will be reacting to Max Lane's discussion. Our next, our first reactor for this afternoon is Dr. Ramon Bomen Guillermo, who is the director of the Center for International Studies of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His current research projects are on the transmission, dissemination, reception, and translation of radical texts and ideas in Southeast Asia using techniques and approaches of translation studies and digital humanities. He's also the author of several books, which include Translation and Revolution, a study of Jose Rizal's Guillermo Tell, published in 2009 by the Ateneo Press, Pokat Paninindigan, Kritika ng Pantayong Pananaw, in 2013 by the UP Press, and the novel Ang Makina ni Mang Turing, again by the UP Press in 2013. Let us all welcome again our first reactor, Dr. Bomen Guillermo.
Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Magandang hapon ka, Dodong, Princess. At sa lahat ng mga mag-aaral at mga guro na nandito ngayong hapon, thank you very much, Max Lane, for your very important lecture. When I was still undergraduate at this university, I read your translation of This Earth of Mankind. And it was a life-changing experience, as I think it was for many students here who had access to your translations. So one thing about these works, Pramoedya's, they may be very powerful, but if they are not translated or transmitted beyond, for example, purely Indonesian readership, then they would not reach Filipinos, for example, or other Southeast Asians, or beyond Asia. So I think your job, your work has really contributed a lot to disseminating these ideas, so that now a lot of people can understand what you were talking about in relation to reading, publication, novels, literature, and revolution. And maybe I can just react in terms of my own experience. And one of my experience, of course, is the impact of your translations. This has been important for me, someone who's studying both literature and history and culture as a whole. And as we know, I'd just like to reiterate to our Filipino audience that such novels as Pramoedya is still legally banned in Indonesia under Pancasila, because any form of so-called transmission of Marxism, Leninism is supposedly illegal in Indonesia still. But even though this restriction has not been revoked, the reality is, on the ground, you can buy copies of these books anywhere, almost anywhere in Indonesia. Because, for example, the biggest bookstore, Pramoedya, they always have this shelf dedicated to Pramoedya Ananta Toer. The editions from Lentera di Pantera, the one that you saw with the colorful covers, they are easily available. And there are so many different titles there that Filipinos are not yet aware of, because they have not yet been translated into Filipino or even to English. So I think that's a challenge to expand our range of books from Pramoedya that we can read. Now, one thing that struck me when I was doing fieldwork in Indonesia more than a decade ago is that if you go to bookshops, if you go to even on the street, you can buy Pramoedya's works. But if you go to the library of the University of Indonesia, you will not find copies of Bumi Manusia or This Earth of Mankind. That's how there's a sort of control of what students can still have access to in their life. I'm not sure about the current library, the very massive library of UI. But at the moment, when I was doing fieldwork there, you could not. It was very strange that you wanted to look for Pramoedya's works in the University of the Indonesia Library. This is UP, for example, like UP in Indonesia, and yet they were not available there, though you could get them elsewhere. Now, a few years later, I would be in Universitas Indonesia once again, and I would give a lecture on these novels in UI. That's what they call Universitas Indonesia. And then, very strangely, after my lecture, they asked me, "Why did you choose Pramoedya's novels to talk about?" Right? As it's a very strange question for me, for example. It's like you're a Filipino and then you're lecturing about Jose Rizal, and then somebody asks you, "Why did you lecture about Jose Rizal? What's interesting about that guy?" Right? But that was quite strange for me in Indonesia, that a professor stood up and asked me why. So I had to explain myself. I had to explain why I chose Pramoedya's novels as an example for my own talk. And then another episode, very interesting, because the last part of your book, Indonesia Out of Exile, discusses the potential future dissemination, popularity, spread of the ideas of these novels themselves among the youth in Indonesia. And very interestingly, in 2019, maybe if you have Netflix, you can watch this. There was a movie adaptation of Bumi Manusia. It's by Hanung Bramantyo, the director, and that was quite a popular film. I think around 1.5 million people watched that film adaptation of Bumi Manusia. I'm not sure if they're working on the other novels, but that created quite an impact among the Indonesian public. And if Max doesn't know, there was a adaptation also of Jose Rizal's novels as a teledrama or telenovela quite recently. And I think each episode of that telenovela had 6 million viewers. 6 million. So that's quite large because it was on TV. If you can compare that with the film Bumi Manusia in 2019, which got 1.5, around 1.5 million viewers in the theaters. It was quite a big, a popular movie at the time. Now, after watching that movie, well, I had my reservations about it. I don't know what you can say. Yeah. So, okay. So I had my reservations about it, but I think I might be more open to that movie than you, because I was thinking, how can we attract the younger people to watch or to read Pramoedya's works? Now, I saw various limitations in the movie, and of course, there's the artistic issues. There's that sense that maybe it did not capture the spirit, a certain spirit in the critical spirit, no, in Pramoedya's work. Also, it might not have captured all the political aspect of the novels. And yet, when I was watching it, it was a very colorful. You can watch it in Netflix if you have Netflix. It's very, the cinematography is very colorful. And I think it's very attractive for young people. It's like something like from TikTok, very colorful and very attractive to the eye. And I was thinking that if we need a movie like this to interest young people in reading the novels, then I'm all for it. If young people watching this movie will say that, hey, I have to go to the bookstore now and buy that book by Pramoedya, then I think it has done its job. Not necessarily that it has transmitted the best aspects of. It's not the most artistic film ever made, but I think that was something positive. It could contribute. So after watching the movie, I talked with Hilmar Farid and Ronnie Agustinus. You know these two guys. So after I talked with Hilmar Farid, and Hilmar Farid is an official of the Indonesian government at the moment, but he was an activist, a long-time activist, and he wrote his dissertation on Pramoedya at the NUS, right? So he's a real expert on Pramoedya. Ronnie Agustinus is one of the most important publishers now in Margin Kiri in Indonesia, publishing left books and also Latin American books in Indonesia. So I had a conversation with them about the film afterwards. And I think we were in agreement that, you know, if it's not really that bad, if it can be a bridge for young people to go and buy that book, to read those books, etc. So I think we were quite, open about the possibility of a sort of function for that popularized movie. Now the next day, there was a young Indonesian girl, and she said, "Did you watch that movie on the Bumi Manusia movie?" She said, and I said, "Yeah, I did." And she said, "It was trash. No, it ruined Pramoedya. It destroyed the novel." Right? So nobody should be a director to do the movie or to the adaptations. But if there are few people watch it, then I don't think we'll have the proper dissemination or the proper influence that we need, so that more people can read that novel. What you 5 episodes, I think the experience here is that it generated a lot of interest in Noli and Fili because you have 6 million viewers per episode. And now, even though it's an adaptation, a reimagining, some people criticize it for not being faithful to the novel because it did a lot of its own thing, right? So that's and small adaptation for television. One reason behind it was the supposed that they put up this show is because of historical revisionism or distortion in the Philippines. Because as you know, one reason why Bongbong Marcos won the elections was through a very massive disinformation campaign that was conducted through social media and all sorts of channels, and lots of historical distortion, of changing history, etc. So that one reason behind this telenovela also was to interest people in looking at history, thinking about history, and trying to see what is the truth in our history. So that I think there was also a positive impetus behind this very popular project. So, but it may not be really up to par in terms of, you know, political content, and yet it did serve a certain purpose. So, that's one question that I would like to ask you. What other means or methods can we use so that Pramoedya's work can become popularized among younger people, not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere? And also, I have a sort of nagging question for a long time, because I have not seen any kind of explicit reference to it. Was Pramoedya's writing of the Buro Quartet ever influenced by Jose Rizal? I know that he refers to Rizal on a historical plane and to his Rizal's role, etc. But I'm not sure about, you know, did he ever, you know, really access these novels and sort of integrate them into his novels? Because there are some parallels which we can actually see, but I've not actually seen this confirmed. That Pramoedya said, you know, I read Jose Rizal's novels, and you know, they influenced me. It's more like political influence, though they were both influenced by Max Havelaar, by Multatuli's Max Havelaar. Of course, Rizal read Max Havelaar too. So I think that's one question that I'm interested in, and thank you for the very committed and impassioned lecture about literature and the political situation in Indonesia, and how central literature is in this political development and evolution of Indonesia today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guillermo, for that very interesting reaction. So the questions that you've asked Dr. Lane will be answered later in the conversation part of the program. So it's again very interesting to hear the importance and the impact of translation in general. So it's not only to reach more audience, but also to let the younger people appreciate texts that were published uh, uh, or classical texts that were published. So we'll hear more from Dr. Guillermo, and we'll also hear Dr. Lane's response. But for now, let me introduce to you our next speaker. So Professor Amado Anthony Mendoza III teaches literature and creative writing courses at the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature in UP Diliman. He has translated Eka Corniawan's short stories into Filipino, some of which are included in the collection Mga Himutok sa Palikuran, published by Savage Mind and Ateneo de Naga University Press in 2021. So let's hear from Professor Mendoza.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Maraming salamat sa CIDS para sa pag-imbita sa akin dito. Thank you, Professor Max Lane, for your wonderful lecture, for your wonderful book. The moderators told me that that we have a lot of ground to cover. We have another part of the program, so I prepared a short reaction, not necessarily on Dr. Lane's lecture, but on his new book. So I'll read it out. So having read the book or reading the book, what struck me the most is the fact that political tensions between the competing moral forces in Indonesia during the 1950s and 1960s were also flanked by a great cultural debate. The debate was mainly between the communist artists, especially from the organization LECRA, or Institute of People's Culture, versus intellectuals and artists from various shades of the anti-communist opposition, represented most notably by the signatories of the Cultural Manifesto, or Manikebu. The debate centered on the role of art and literature in effecting revolutionary change. Pramoedya was, of course, in the center of that debate because it was during that time, that period, that he picked a side. It was also during that time that he started to believe and put into practice that literature can serve the aims and aspirations of a revolution. As an aside, Dr. Guillermo has a Filipino translation of Pramoedya's famed communist book, Sekali Peristiwa di Banten Salatan. So if anyone's interested, I think you can access it in his ResearchGate account. So going back, and of course, when the New Order regime came into power, he suffered because of those beliefs and conviction. Intellectuals and writers who were once his opponents had mixed feelings, but for most part, the prevailing sentiment of anti-communist writers and intellectuals was that of a victor. That at long last, writers and intellectuals who tried to place art and literature under the command of politics were finally excluded from Indonesian public life. That at long last, the slogan or semboyan, politics adala panglima, is nothing but a semboyan or slogan from a bygone era. Something akin to what happened in Indonesia in 1965 is also happening in the Philippines in the present. Just last year, the Commission sa Wikang Filipino, or Commission on Philippine Language, banned the publication of 5 books for allegedly containing subversive ideas. Months before that incident, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, a task force designed to operationalize the whole-of-nation approach of the Duterte administration, endorsed and ordered the removal of communist books, quote, from the shelves of libraries of state universities and colleges. There were also attacks on local bookstores akin to the razzia, or book raids, being conducted by anti-communist and conservative groups in several bookstores in different cities in Indonesia. In saying all this and having read the story of Buro Quartet's publication and the stories of the people who made it possible, despite all odds, what's evident here is that books remain a powerful instrument in order to speak truth to power. And may we continue to speak truth to power, whether through books or active participation in social movements, despite all odds and forces that militate against our visions of a just future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendoza, for your reaction. I think it was very interesting and also very relevant to also mention the state of censorship of progressive and revolutionary literature. As he said, not only in the Philippines, but also in Indonesia. Maybe that's one theme that our 3 panelists, our 3 speakers can talk about in the next part of our program. But before that, we'll just like to remind and invite everyone to the other installments of the World Experts Lecture Series. Today, we're having Indonesia Out of Exile, focusing on literature with the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature. Tomorrow, we'll have Class, Nation, and Social Revolution in Indonesia and the Philippines, which will be happening here at the same time, hosted by the UP SIDS Program on Alternative Development. And then lastly, on Saturday, hosted by the School of Labor and Industrial Relations, or SOLAIR, we'll be having the Indonesian Labor Movement, Class, Nation, and Forgetting of Development. All right, so we hope that we'll see you in the next few World Expert Lecture Series installments.
And as you can see, Professor C is holding Dr. Lane's book, Indonesia Out of Exile, How Pramoedya's Puro Quartet Killed the Dictatorship. You may get a copy of this book starting tomorrow until Sunday. So,
They'll be available here.
yes,
Yes.
here.
So that's another incentive for you to go and attend the lecture tomorrow. So now we'll be going to the next part of our program. We'll be having a conversation among the three speakers. Actually, Dr. Guillermo earlier already gave some questions to Max, which Max can respond to. And then if they have any questions to each other, they can freely converse until the next part of the program. Max, do you want to start by answering or responding to Bowman's questions?
Okay. Many questions, that need to be responded to here. I'm tempted to start with that terrible film, but I won't. It was mentioned, you mentioned, for example, that you could not find Pramoedya's books in the libraries, and that even at the University of Indonesia, you had somebody ask, why would you possibly be interested? This is symbolic of a very significant part of what happened after 1965. One way to describe what happened after 1965 as the military took power, terrorized the 20 million people who were active in the left by killing 1 million and jailing 25,000 and banning everything under the sun slightly left of center. I like to describe that process as a counter-revolution. But the thing to note is that it was not a counter-revolution against a socialist revolution or a social revolution. The government that was in power before 1965 was not a revolutionary government. There was not a single representative, there was not a single member of the Communist Party or the left wing of the Nationalist Party or any of the radical left groups in the cabinet with even a single minister. They were excluded from power. So it wasn't a counter-revolution against a left-wing government or a revolutionary government. No. What was it a counter-revolution against? I don't think it's almost accurate, in my opinion, but not quite accurate, to say it was a counter-revolution against the National Democratic Revolution or the Nat-Dem Revolution. I think Nat-Dem's the phrase here. But it was certainly a counter-revolution against the national revolution, that is, the process of creating and finally consolidating a nation. And one of them, and because Sukarno himself is the main spokesperson of the revolutionary left at the time, even though he had his own contradictions, kept repeating over and over and over again, even up until the last moments that he was able to give speeches to the public. Nation building and even character building is not yet complete. Now, and I think this also connects to Philippines and Indonesia having very different histories. But a part of this counter-revolution against the nation was the decision in the early 1970s, which I hope some young Indonesian historian will research and uncover, decision to no longer teach literature in the school system. I think Indonesia must be one of the only significant countries in the world where literature itself, where the literature of the nation is not at all taught whatsoever. There's a subject in junior high school and senior high school called Indonesian language, and you study Indonesian language, and you learn off by heart a list of novels and who wrote them, and poems, and who wrote them, and the year they were published. The list, of course, excludes everybody on the left, including Pramoedya. But no student for 50 years, for half a century, no student has been asked to read them. No student has been asked to discuss them in class. How could they ever read or write essays or anything? So the national literature has been wiped from the population's memory, and I think that was a necessary act against the nation that the Suharto regime had to take place to minimize the resistance over time to the foreign incursions that began both commercially and culturally since then. And now, of course, literature is starting to expand rapidly. If you ask the opinion, what's the state of Indonesian literature today, I wouldn't even dare try to answer because I can't keep up. I can't keep up. But this ferment in literature is also a response to half a century of no literature in the schools. I ask people in the Philippines, do you teach literature in high school? And they say, yes. In Malaysia, yes. In Singapore, yes. In Singapore, they even teach Pramoedya in the high school. In Australia, yes. Everywhere, yes. Although one person said in Ireland, no, but I'm not sure. But it's, it's a major anti-national act of, criminal act to go for half a decade to stop young people reading literature. But now I think there's a backlash against that. Interestingly, facilitated by WhatsApp, because the kids circulate. Have you read this? Have you read this? Have you read this? So don't be down on WhatsApp, because it's actually not a counteraction to reading books. It's actually what promotes books. And that's I could tell a story about that. I won't stop. I've spoken too long. So maybe just one comment on the film. Well, I won't get into how bad it is and the key things that are missing from it and so on. But in terms of impact, 1.5 million people saw it. I think mainly because of the heartthrob teenage boy actor. Yeah. Hello? 1.5 million people did see it, but I think that was more a result of the teenage heartthrob boy in it. After 1.5 million people saw it, was there a big surge in book sales? No. Because, and this is a difficult thing. Someone also asked me, well, I don't need to be asked because I often rave on about this anyway. Here you have Pramoedya Ananta, great Indonesian author, recognized everywhere, outstanding reviews in the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, England, everywhere. But not a single book in English about Pramoedya. Even 40 years on. Do people working in Southeast Asian studies, except in the Philippines, I must note now, write about Pramoedya, teach about Pramoedya? No. Why not? Because you can't popularize Pramoedya's books, especially Pramoedya, with young people or anybody, without them being confronted and challenged. Are you going to take sides in all of this or not? You said life-changing, then? You can't. That's why the film did not challenge anyone. You can't combine, you can't get people engaged with Pramoedya's books on the one hand and not challenge them on the other. To not challenge them means you haven't actually engaged them with him, with his books. And that's why a lot of the liberal academe in the Western world don't like to concentrate too much on the books, because you can't say Pramoedya is great on the one hand and go on in neutral gear, not taking a position on what's happening in Indonesia or the world on the other. Or you can say Pramoedya was great, but not his Bumi Manusia Quartet, his 50 short stories. Or they're good, but Bumi Manusia may be a bit too didactic or whatever. You get a little bit of that. So that's on the film, and maybe that's enough for the time being. We can get back to other topics maybe.
Sorry, I just have one question. Well, anyway, I just wanted to add something about the movie because a few years before the filming of Bumi Manusia, there was another novel which was filmed, Laskar Pelangi by Andrea Hirata, and the Rainbow Warriors. It was a very super popular movie in Indonesia, and when the movie was released, it actually led to a massive demand for the novel. Yeah. So Andrea Hirata's novel really was published in the millions because of the high demand for his work, because of all the films that were partly because of the films that were made of them. So maybe if you have the chance, you can also watch. I think some of these movies they have on the subtitles, but they were massively popular in Indonesia. I thought that maybe if this had been done with, if this could be done with Pramoedya's novels, then we would have a similar impact as it had with Andrea Hirata's novels. And of course, maybe it didn't have that effect. But the idea was that the directors of the film, Riri Riza, the director of these films, including that one by Andrea Hirata, was also asked to direct Pramoedya's novels, but it just fell through. It didn't work out. So there were other directors who had great reputations, had good work that they approached to film Pramoedya's novels, but it didn't really work out. So it ended up with a very commercial director, Hanung Bramantyo. So that I think that was one factor probably behind this. But I was hoping that that would happen due to this film. Now another question, because you also mentioned this in your book, is about what do you think of Wiji Tukul? Because we have here the Filipino translator of Wiji Tukul from Bahasa Indonesia to Filipino. So including Mark Garcia, another of our colleagues, they translated all of Wiji Tukul's works into Filipino. And as of now, I don't think there's a complete English translation of Wiji Tukul's works available. So maybe can you talk about, if you can't talk about everyone who's turning up now in the literary world in Indonesia, the younger or the more recent ones, what can you say about Wiji Tukul?
I think it's interesting if you ask about Wiji Tukul, because I think the history of Indonesia from the 1970s until 2000, in some ways, the three different decades have an iconic writer of descent for each decade. For the 1970s, I think the writer that galvanized thousands of young people in opposition to Suharto and also enriched the poetry itself was W.S. Rendra. I attended some of his, in the 70s, I was able to attend some of his plays and poetry reading, and you'll get an audience of 5,000 to 10,000 people in uproar and excitement as he articulated the popular criticism and understanding of the new order. Many of his poems became manifestos for the anti-new order students during that period. Ada yang giant, ada yang terhina. Those he had a very clear perspective on that.
Hello. Sorry.
There are those who sit and those who are sat upon. He had a very clear concept of the division of society, and even though he was anti-communist and his ambiguous relation with Pramoedya, I discuss in his book, but he was the voice, and actually he was more a voice of the opposition to Suharto than students or political. In the 80s, it was Pramoedya and Hastamitra that really was the literary vanguard and had a vanguard role even separate from any political organization. And in 1990s, it was Wijitukul. And his, one line from his poems became a slogan for the whole movement. Only one word, resist. And of course, he was an active member of the People's Democratic Party. And he was, in the early period, organizer of theater. My partner, my wife, was one of the people that was involved in his theater group in the very early 1990s when she was a labor organizer. But then his poetry also became, manifestos or what was declared at rallies and so on. Because he disappeared, assumed murdered in 1997 or 1998. And his poetry is still used when there are protests and demonstrations today. Narendra, Pramoedya, Wijitukul, they sort of represent three stages in the evolution of an alternative vision for Indonesia that started in the 70s. So now, from 2000 until now, I think it's a much more of a whirlpool, much not crystallized yet as to what, maybe I'm biased, but I think my partner Pfizer's plays are very significant in this process, in particular her Silent Song of the Genji Flowers, because it starts to rehumanize the left. But there are also lots of others. There's the essays of Linda Cristanti. There's quite a lot. But as I said, I don't want to point out this one or that one because I think I haven't read 80% or 90% because there's just so much ferment now without any particular one or two or three or four crystallizing as the sort of one the works really stirring things up.
You mentioned in your book that Pramoedya refused or wasn't able to write about his experience during the New Order for some specified reason. But obviously, there were writers who came up, especially the Angkatan 2000, who wrote about the legacies that New Order left upon its wake. So I just wanted to ask how you regard those novels, for instance, Ayu Utami or Laxmi Pamunchak, or any other writer that tried to write about Namlima or 1965.
I think the novels and works written about 1965, in most cases, I still think they're too limited in their outlook. And nearly all of the characters in those books which are associated with the left are either accidentally left or regret being left. There's no literature except if you read or look at Pfizer's play, all of whom characters are ex-members of Garwani. There's no regret, that's all as is. So that treating the left in its own right and not as people got dragged in unknowingly or whatever, that kind of literature is not really developed yet. When we see more of that, then you can know the unfinished ferment is heading towards being finished, and you'll start to get crystallized, more crystallized trajectories. So no, I'm not really a fan.
A bit. I hope that the three of you were satisfied with the conversation. Or if you have any other thoughts, of course, we can share it now that we are going to the next part of the program, which is the open forum. So after the conversation, everyone is free to ask any questions. Okay, we have a lot.
So, yes, please say your name before you ask a question. Oh, okay. And then after him.
Congratulations, Mr. Lane. I'm Voltaire Veneracion. I'm a human rights lawyer. I was an editor of our campus paper here. So I'm also a writer, and Professor Bowman was my teacher on Rizal. My favorite teacher on Rizal. And anyway, I bought your translation of the Earth of Mankind. I read about this in John Nery's book on the impact of Jose Rizal on Southeast Asia. So that's probably why your name sounded familiar and why I was attracted to to your lecture. When Bowman mentioned that you translated this book, I checked and it says over here that you were indeed the translator of the Buru Quartet that's found in our bookshops. I love your translation, and even though it's, as you said, it's not about the Indonesian identity, I felt that it was about some sort of identity crisis. There was no Indonesian identity, but it was about a young man who was trying to figure out what he was in this emerging order. And that's something that I could also relate to. But anyway, it says over here that you translated this while you were second secretary of the Australian Embassy. And after your translation, you were actually recalled in 1981. Can you tell us the story about what happened? How were you able to translate all 4 books? And what were on what basis were you recalled? And what was your life in diplomatic service after this experience? Thank you.
Yes, I translated the first book, This Earth of Mankind, while I was working in the Australian Embassy. And because I was such a good boy, so I turned out later to decide not to be a good boy. But at that point, I was a very good boy. So I thought when I finished it, and Penguin Books had accepted it, I should tell my boss, the ambassador. And after I told him, he said, you have to leave Indonesia within 24 hours. And I asked why. I said, well, if I let you stay and you publish the book, the Indonesian government will ask me, why did you let Max Lane stay in Indonesia after he translated a book that was banned? So that was their justification. I said to him, no, this is by publishing this in English, this will assist cultural relations. But he said that was disingenuous just to say that. The other books, you asked my ongoing diplomatic career, basically there was none. So I came back and I was assigned to a room with nobody in it and given work that didn't exist. So I figured that in any case, I didn't like it. Basically, if you're in the diplomatic corps, your opinion is whatever the opinion of the government. If the government changes, your opinion has to change, not for me. In any case, I didn't agree with any of the opinions of the government. So I left that and I concentrated the next few years full time on translating the Pramoedya novels until my savings ran out. And then I had to start finding a job here and a job there. But I also got involved in organized political activity because Pramoedya said to me once, we were chatting, and he said, Max, he said, you seem to be left-wing. And I said, yeah, I suppose I have left-wing. He said, no, you're not. I said, why not? He said, because you don't belong to a party. Don't tell me you're left-wing if you don't belong to an organization. And of course, one of the things he did after the Suharto fell was immediately join a party, even though he was old and not, and he wasn't a political organizer person. He was a full, total focused on writer. He took the conscious act as soon as Suharto fell of joining the People's Democratic Party in a big event, packed hall. I'm joining. You should join. And that's what he also said to me. So when I got back to Australia, that's the direction I went in.
Can I just add one small thing? Because when you translated his novels, you mentioned in the book Indonesia Out of Exile that Pramoedya asked you to also translate one of his very thick novels, Arus Balik, or Reverse Flow. And I think this novel in particular would be very interesting for Filipinos to read because it's about ancient archipelagos and the place of Indonesia, Malaysia, and other, like Philippines, for example, would be part of this imagination of Pramoedya. So why haven't you finished or translating Arus Balik? Because I think if you do finish it, you'll find a Philippine readership. It has some impact on us. It has some ideas which might interest a lot of our historians and writers.
Yes, I feel very guilty about that, not having translated this 800-page novel. But I've just had to focus on other things in as consequence of what he said, get involved in political activity. So that framed my activity for a long time. And maybe I will still get around it, but at the moment, I've got 2 books I'm committed to write for publishers. One is my memoirs of experiences with Indonesia, the Philippines, and East Timor, working with movements in those 3 countries. Another one is a new history of modern Indonesia. And there's also another one which I can't talk about yet, but it's not finalized. But if somehow before my energy runs out, because I'm not getting younger, but if sometime my energy doesn't run out, I would really like to get to do Arus Balik. And then, because that's one of the sad things that, the first 4 novels were initially published by Penguin in Australia. And then Penguin in America took it over. And then there was when the shift to America took place, there was a discussion of what should be published next. Of course, very naturally, the first thing to be published next was a selection, although I don't really agree with the selection, but the selection of essays Pramoedya wrote in prison. But it's not a full selection. But after that, the choice was translate the other novels he wrote on Buru Island, Arak Dedes and Arus Balik, or translate works from the 1950s. And the people who had most of the influence
the publisher was already dead until I see a manuscript in English.
The opinion of the people I asked. In that came from American circles. So after This Earth of Mankind series and Pramoedya's Prison Reflections, Silent Song of a Mute or a Mute Soliloquy, the next books were published, translated from the 1950s. I eventually translated Arak Dedes, but that was published in a small print run in Singapore, now out of print. It's possible Penguin might print it again now that the Indonesian of Exile is selling very well. But Aras Balik, yes, that's a debt I still owe.
We still have members of the audience who would like to ask a question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon po. Thank you for this informative lecture, Dr. Maxine. My name is Jamil Christian Elisa. I am a Bachelor in Philippine Education student in Philippine Normal University, Manila. Actually, I have 3 questions, 1 question per speaker. Because I am fascinated on how your discussion have shifted to how Pramoedya and Toer is taught in the education system. So I would like to ask, the context of the question is that um, Southeast Asian literature, including Indonesian Southeast Asian literature, including Indonesian literature, is taught in grade 9 in Filipino. And I think Dr. Guillermo and Professor Mendoza would agree with me that when it comes to translation, it is somewhat one of the underappreciated aspects when it comes to the Filipino language. So my question to Dr. Max Lane is, among the works of Pramoedya and Ananta, what what are the works that can be taught in in the levels of grade 9, specifically adolescents from 14 to 16? And my question to Dr. Guillermo is, if ever man na isasalin po natin sa Pilipino yung mga akda ni Pramoedya and Ananta, ano po yung mga hamon po na kakaharapin po natin sa pagsasalin nito? And to Professor Mendoza, ang tanong ko naman po ay, ano naman pong teoryang pampanitikan na maaari po nating gamitin o na maka-Pilipinong teoryang pampanitikan na maaari natin gamitin upang suriin ang mga akda ni Pramoedya and Ananta at makabuo po ng mga gabay na katanungan para masuri po ito ng mga kabataan sa Baitang Siyam. Salamat po.
I can't really answer the question as to what books one would recommend to be taught here from Pramoedya at that early age. I would need to know more about the Philippines education system and levels of familiarity with literature and so on. But yeah, possibly some of the very early 1950s short novels or even Bumi Manusia. But because Bumi Manusia can be read at different levels. It can be read just as a story. It can be read as a story uncovering, or not uncovering, a story bringing alive historical dynamics. It can be read as a story about character, strength of character, and morality. So it can be read at different levels. And I think Pramoedya wrote those novels because the whole concept of the novel is very weak in Indonesia. I don't know about here, yeah, but in Indonesia the concept is not. So I think Pramoedya wrote those novels, especially the first 2, conscious of the fact the readers would be people not familiar with novels, not used to reading long work, and not used, and compared to Western novels, because he was very familiar with Western literature as well as translated Russian literature and so on. The whole question of psychology, which by the late 19th century, early 20th century, the flow through from Freud and Jung, etc., into the understanding of individual psychology was already absorbed into the literature. In Bumi Manusia, he has to have the doctor explain the psychoanalysis of one of the characters. You probably would not get that in a mid-20th century Western novel because it's already absorbed. So if it's taken slowly, it can be read also at an early age, at whatever level.
Hello, yeah. So on the question of translating into Filipino of Indonesian works, unfortunately, only few people have really done this. Although we have Telma Quintanar's translation of Bumi Manusya as Daigdig ng Tao. And there are very few Filipinos who have really tried. I mean, the younger generation now, they're really doing much more translations from Indonesian into Filipino. The generation of Arlo, for example, are quite into it. And they really did study the language and are capable of translating even poetry into Filipino. Now, what my opinion is that since Bahasa Indonesia or Malay, in a way, is closely related to Tagalog, the kind of cultural gap or linguistic gap that we can see between English and Bahasa Indonesia is not so distant when you look at Filipino. So it's like the gap between Bahasa Indonesia and Filipino is like this, between Bahasa Indonesia and English is like that. And then if you translate it to English, there are so many cultural aspects that require elucidation, translation, so that the reader in English could understand what's happening or the concept in that the main concepts in those works. So I think it's rather easier for us to undertake in terms of the linguistic affinities, in terms of certain cultural commonalities. It's kind of easier for us to do translations from Bahasa Indonesia, even Bahasa Malaysia, into Bahasa Filipina. So it's kind of easier for us to do this, although to develop a kind of let's say core, an adequate number of translators from Bahasa Indonesia to Filipino to professionalize it. I think that's what we need to do, because we're doing this now on a very individual level. And when you're doing this, sometimes it's hard to ask each other, did I translate this correctly, or can I do it better? So it's better if we have people who we can ask, we can communicate. And unfortunately, this kind of interest is most of the time one way. I can hardly see any Indonesians translating Philippine material from our languages into Bahasa Indonesia. It's one way. Yeah, so it's really a one-way love affair in terms of right. For example, Arlo translates Eka Kurniawan, the let's say the most trendy writer in Indonesia today. So really up to date. But in terms of what we're doing now and what Indonesians perceive or read of our works, in terms at least of those written in our languages, Filipino and other Philippine languages, there's hardly any impact or any awareness in Indonesia. So I think that's one thing. We also need help from Indonesian writers, translators, so that we can strengthen our own practices here in the Philippines. So we have to develop this in a two-way process also. I'm sure Max Lane would be in agreement with this, that this is some kind of internationalism, some of thing that we might have to deepen between Filipinos and Indonesians. So we're trying hard. We've advanced a bit further than we were before. We're now able to do a lot more than we have been doing in the past. But you know that for young people, I think I suggest if you're really interested in these things, in Pramoedya, etc., or in Indonesian writers, Malaysian also, to study the language, and we can help each other translate these works that are interesting to us into our own language. I mentioned earlier Arus Balik, the novel, that 800-page monster, is very important for Filipinos to read, but there's no translation yet into English. So I think it's a challenge for the future for us. So in terms of learning, Indonesia also gives us various opportunities to learn their language, right? So there are Dharma Siswa, etc. You know, so unlike we in the Philippines, we don't have that kind of initiative that teach Filipino or other languages in the Philippines to foreigners. You don't have that kind of program, but they do. And also, you can do your further studies in Indonesia if you like. They have this kind of scholarship, etc. So I'm optimistic about the future of translations. Hopefully, they will do better in Indonesia in terms of being aware of Philippine literature or even Southeast Asian literature in general, like Thai or Vietnamese, to translate these into their own language.
To answer your question, the practical aspect of it, can actually look at Noel Teodoro's translation of Pramoedya's short stories. It's called Sunat. The title in Filipino is Pagtutuli. So I think that's a story you can teach to grade 9 students. But personally, I always regard most of Pramoedya's writings, even his novels, as Bildungsroman or coming of age novels. So you can basically plug it in your curriculum for grade 9 or grade 10 students and actually teach it to them. Another such story is entitled Kemudia Dia Lahir, or In the Twilight Born. That's the English translation. It's a semi-autobiographical story, I think, and it tells the story of a pre-adolescent boy who is witnessing his parents and his kin's involvement in the burgeoning anti-colonial movement against the Dutch during the 1930s, I think. So it's interesting. It's an interesting way to teach, or at least introduce to grade 9 students, how people of their age can be involved, or at least in social movements, I guess. Your second question is a bit difficult, no? Teoryang pampanitikan. Well, I always regard the reason I chose to be a translator from, for instance, Bahasa Indonesia to Filipino, instead of going the lucrative route of translating from Indonesian to English, for instance, is because I want to vanquish what Benedict Anderson mentioned, and Jose Rizal mentioned, as the hantu perbandingan, or specters of comparison between supposedly two cultures, Indonesia and Philippines, that have a lot of affinities or a lot of similarities with each other. So by translating works from Indonesian into Filipino, I try to see the relationship, or at least an elective affinity between such cultures. So because I'm not a teacher in grade 9 or grade 10, can't really suggest. I understand that you teach in those levels, literature is being taught in that way, that you have to package it with a specific theory or literary trend or literary style, even if it doesn't really fit the bill, just so you can get past the curriculum. But I think just translating literary works from its source language to your own language gives, for instance, the translators and its prospective readers more insight about possible convergences between, for instance, Philippine and Indonesian culture. So I can't really answer your second question. I guess it's a question that teachers from that level should answer, or would be able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for answering that question about translation and reading and requiring texts in grade school. Do we have any other questions from the crowd? For our attendees in Zoom, you can also input your questions via the chat box if you have anything in mind. But for the crowd here, do you want to ask anything from our panelists? Yes, please, another question from you.
Well, first, I'd just like to suggest, maybe as an exercise, use ChatGPT because it actually does a decent job of translating from one language to another. And we already have Dr. Max Lane's translation. So that might be one way for you to not to fight ChatGPT, but to somehow work with it and try to, a grade 9 student would be able to assess already how good the translation would be from the English translation into Filipino. But anyway, my question is to Dr. Max Lane, the legal basis for banning the book, especially this first book, which is the one that I read. I don't see anything subversive or revolutionary about it. It's as Sir said, it's a coming of age story. So there's nothing seditious about it or rebellious. And so what was the basis for banning this, the legal basis for banning this, as well as for Australia's violation of your academic freedom or your freedom of speech?
The Attorney General of the government of Indonesia at the time issued a statement saying the book was banned for spreading Marxism-Leninism. The instruction noted that it had to be recognized that Pramoedya Ananta was a very clever writer, so it would be impossible to actually pick out the evidence of Marxism-Leninism in his book because it was all disguised. That was the formal justification, but I think I think it actually in the Indonesian context the book does teach rebelliousness, independence from authority, but in addition to that, it countered the existing histories of Indonesia, and as I mentioned earlier, because for many, indeed, without a deep reading, it comes across as a democratic-spirited humanist novel. It helped destroy the stereotype, black propaganda stereotype, that people like Pramoedya were evil. So that was also extremely dangerous for the government, and the impact the book had on young people, which led up to the 1990s radicalization, indicated that the government's fears were justified. That did contribute to the process of radicalization amongst young people.
Just to add to that, well, I think some of us have read also some of the other volumes of these novels. And I think some of my students here have also read these other novels. And actually, my favorite is not This Earth of Mankind. It's Anak Semua Bangsa, or Child of All Nations. That's a second volume, because it has a lot about the Philippines, about Andres Bonifacio, about Jose Rizal, about organizing, how to organize a revolutionary movement. And there, Minke's Dutch friend, I think Ter discusses ideas which parallel Marx. In fact, some of the sentences are actually paraphrase of Communist Manifesto if you study it properly. So if the Indonesian authorities had actually gone through these works and had known anything at all about Marxism, Leninism, they would have at least seen some evidence in The Child of All Nations and also the other novels, if you really look at it. But in fact, they were just ignorant. They didn't even read the novel. And it was all about, as Arlo said, all about the author. Just because he was an ex-tapol or ex-political prisoner, he couldn't allow him to write. He couldn't allow anyone to read his works. And you had to continually demonize these ex-political prisoners. So it didn't really matter what was written in these novels in the first place. They were written by someone who was accused of being a communist, a subversive, and therefore his works by definition could not be read. But if you actually look at the novels themselves, they have actually a lot of progressive ideas, a lot of ideas to question authority and to challenge feudal and authoritarian rule. So as far as that's concerned, you can actually read them in that light, and go through them very carefully. So as a Filipino, actually my favorite is the Child of All Nations, and hopefully one day a translation in Filipino will come out. Yes.
Thank you. We still have more room for questions. So anyone from the audience would like to ask Dr. Max Lane, Dr. Guillermo, and Professor Mendoza? Oh, okay.
Hello. Dr. Max Lane. I am Lance Romulus Leary. I'm currently a student of Philippine Studies and a former student of Sir Arlo, and currently a student of Sir Bomen in C30. I actually have the Buro Quartet. Yeah, I bought it last year. However, I was not yet able to read the second book because I just got it from our house last month. Uh, my question would be about you talked about the unfinished ferment in terms of the social movements in Indonesia. Um, you saw some palpable trends in the humanities, in the newspapers, as well as uh, there is somehow a resurgence in the youth's interest in studying Pramoedya. Uh, how, how would how do you think that uh, let me just think of, I'm quite starstruck the moment. Sorry. Okay. uh, uh, what lessons can be gained by Filipino national democratic movements and the social movements in Indonesia in terms of overcoming censorship and because as mentioned earlier by Sir Arlo, uh, there is a pressing need for these movements to actually evaluate themselves to further their struggles. So, what lessons can be gained by Filipinos from the social movements in Indonesia, particularly in terms of overcoming censorship and building alliances, building their forces? Because in Indonesia, there's a lot of news that uh, their mobilizations actually numbers into thousands, hundreds of thousands. However, as you mentioned, there is no center that cannot hold them. There is no actually a movement that is really interested in knowing history or ruining nationalist values. Thank you.
I think the drawing conclusions from the experience of the Indonesian social movements, etc., that are relevant to the Philippines, that's a big ask. But perhaps it's the sort of question that will come up and come up more concretely or in a more central way in my talk tomorrow. So maybe that aspect. But on the question of censorship, I mean, again, I'm sure the conditions here are very different from the conditions that Pramoedya faced in 1980s. Probably 1980s is probably like the peak of the Marcos authoritarianism here. But it was a combination of courageous defiance on the one hand, complemented by very careful, systematic, tactical moves on the other. And of course, that's almost cliche saying that, very generalized, but I'm sure that that applies everywhere. In terms of more concrete comparisons, come tomorrow. If you come tomorrow, you can also buy my new book.
Right. I think that would be the last question for our public lecture this afternoon. Thank you again for everyone who asked their question and gave their comments earlier. And of course, thank you to our three speakers for this afternoon who shared their knowledge about Pramoedya Ananta Toer in Indonesia out of exile. And by the way, given that everyone stayed here after 3 hours of listening to our very wonderful speakers, we have a special surprise for you on that side of the stage. We have merienda or snacks for everyone. So if you're into pizza, we have pizza over there. Thank you to the Office for International Linkages for the funding for this event. And now to close the event, we'll be having one last remarks. The closing remarks from none other than the former Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and a professor of mathematics at the UP College of Science, and also a close friend to Max Lane, I suppose. We have here Dr. Fidel Nemenzol. So give him a round of applause.
Hello. Yes, maraming salamat sa thank you to the Department of Filipino and Philippine Language for organizing this lecture.
Hello.
And of course, our host, CIDS. No? Maraming salamat kay Bomen at kay Arlo. And to the UP system and the Office for International Linkages for the funding that made it possible for us to invite Max Lane to UP under the World Experts Lecture Series. Yes, Max, experts like you definitely give meaning to our World Expert Lecture Series. The WELS is a key program of our university's internationalization efforts, no? By bringing internationally known scholars to give lectures on campus or team up with our faculty in mentoring graduate students. No? Among the first, if I remember right, among the first, if not the first international visitor we had under this program was the philosopher Richard Rorty, who gave a lecture on campus more than 2 decades ago. And thank you, Max, for your excellent translation of Pramoedya and for making him accessible to non-Bahasa speakers like us, especially those in the movement for social change. I was a student activist in 1981 when the first novel of the Budu Quartet, This Earth of Mankind, was introduced by a comrade friend of mine, Fred Quintanar, who actually translated the novel into Filipino. It's interesting to Sir Fred. Like me, he was a student of mathematics. He was at Cornell studying mathematics, but influenced by Ben Anderson and the Southeast Asianist. He dropped out of mathematics. Andito pala si Alvin. We were friends of Fred. He dropped out of mathematics, taught himself Bahasa, went to Indonesia, stayed there for a few months, and entered the Philippines through the back door, and joined the social movement. Kagrupo ko si Fred noong 1981. So when he introduced the book to me, it was so exciting. This was the height of repression and martial law, and how exciting it was to get hold of books that were banned. In 1982, when I visited my parents in Australia, I was so happy to have met Max Lane. I met Max in meetings of the Socialist Workers' Party. And if you remember Max Carpa, the Committee Against Repression in the Pacific and Asia, where we plotted and planned solidarity activities in support of the movement against the dictatorship. For activists of my generation, literature was a weapon for revolution and social change. No? It broadened our world, it broadened our flanks. We learned that our struggles against the dictatorship, against neocolonialism, its local agents, were universal struggles. In the story of Minke, we recognized our own challenges, no? The injustices and indignities of colonial and neo-colonial rule, and the need to foment intellectual and cultural ferment, and of course, awaken national consciousness and prepare the ground for it. Although the Budo Quartet is now part of the canon of world literature, in particular, progressive world literature, it is sad that this classic is not as widely disseminated in the Indonesian schools. No? In the same way that Noli and Pili are taught in the Philippines and are now part of pop TV culture. Thanks to Bomen. I just want to mention, since this is International Women's Month, that the Budo Quartet is actually full of very strong female characters. In particular, si Mama, who dominated the business world full of men, and that woman in charge of Minke's publication, no? Who did not only write but also was not afraid to wield the gun. Again, thank you, Max, for giving us Pramoedya and for sharing with us the bigger story of Indonesian nationalism. Maraming salamat kay Bomen at kay Arlo. Maraming salamat sa Departamento ng Pilipino at Panitigang Pilipino, sa CIDS, kay Benji Velasco, at maraming salamat sa inyong lahat sa pagdalo sa lecture ni Max Lane. Gandang hapon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nemenzo, for being with us here today and for sharing. We also want to thank of course, the members of the audience for attending, and of course, to our three speakers, Dr. Max Lane, Dr. Guillermo, and Professor Mendoza.
Right, and that ends our program for this afternoon. Again, I am Monsi from UPSIDS, OutDev, and also from the FPP.
And I am Deidre Morales from UP Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature.
Yes, and thank you. That's all.
Thank
We'll
you.
hope to
Good
see you in
afternoon.
our next lectures.
Yes.
Bye, bye. Thank you. And of course, please get some pizza,
Snacks.
pizza slices, some revolutionary pizza slices on the side. Thank you. Can we invite our chairperson, Sir Sheds,
For picture taking.
and Chansey Fidel, Sir Fidel, maybe we're gonna have a photo with the speakers, and also the OutDev team. We have Sir Benji, Kaanging, Ryan, Hans, and Arvin. Thank you so much as well for organizing this event. Can we have a photo with the speakers? Again, for the OutDev team, let's have a photo here. And everyone, the pizza is over there. Please get your slices.